So good evening, everyone. I'd like to say it's great to see you here at St. Paul's, but I can't see beyond the first pew. But nonetheless, it is great that you have come out to the first of our Music at St. Paul's events this season. I'll tell you what's coming up in the next few weeks is on November 9th, we have our Remembrance Day memory by the Orpheus Sinfonietta, who will be playing Prokofiev's Seventh Symphony. And at the same time, Ted Barris is going to come in and talk about the Battle of Britain. He's just written a book about that, and he's going to share some reflections on what that meant. The Prokofiev Symphony was written shortly after the Second World War and connects directly to what he thought the Battle of Britain was all about. That's November 9th in the evening here. So I hope you can attend that. You'll see posters outside for that event. And then on November 30th, which is a Sunday evening, we're performing the chamber group Cantori Sine Nomine is performing Bach's Christmas Oratorio. That's with full orchestra and choir and soloists, and it tells the story of the 12 days of Christmas. So it's a great way to start off Advent 1 and the Christmas season, is to hear the story in the glorious music that Bach wrote. So I hope that you will come out on that particular day to just have a delightful evening of Bach's music. This evening is the first of our events this year, and it is a reprise of a presentation that John Hayes made last February that got iced out, and some of you people who are close managed to make it here, but it was not a friendly weather day, and today we have a very friendly weather day. So we're really glad that John was able to recruit his quartet and his music director, and is able to put this presentation on for us again. The one thing I should mention, you had a little slip of paper that you picked up, which is a survey about how you found out about this event. And if you want to be part of our mailing list of concerts, upcoming concerts, put your email on that, and we will send you messages directly about events that are coming up. So, our first event, music and music in the silent films with John Haynes.
Yes, wouldn't that be something if there was silence for 1.5 hours? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I'm glad there's no snow. I want to take you back to old Uxbridge with a story about two girls. The first girl, let's call her girl number 1. She'll remain anonymous for a few seconds. Girl number 1 was living in Uxbridge. She'd been raised in Uxbridge, living the last days of the old movie theater. The old movie theater was found on Main Street, right there, where that red rectangle is. And the movies had been on Main Street for the better part of 40 years in Uxbridge. This would be the late 1940s. And girl number 1 told me about, walking into this theater, going through the ticket booth, the area and the square at the center of it, where that little poster is. That's where the booth was to pay your money, and then you would go through the doors on the side, if I'm not mistaken. She remembers walking in. She remembers the chairs. She remembers the screen in the back. This was a fairly large theater at the time. This was the Capitol Theater, which sat about 200 people. That's girl number 1. My second story is about girl number 2, a few years later. So that was the late 1940s. This would be around 1950. By 1950, the movies, the time of the movies in Uxbridge being on Main Street had ended, and they were now on Brock Street. A new theater had opened called the Rio, later to be the Roxy. And girl number 2 remembers moving, she'd come from Montreal, and she remembers her father who bought the store on the right with the Coca-Cola sign. This picture is taken around this time. Her father bought the store, but along with the store came the old theater. By then, it was not being used. And girl number 2 remembers her family using the old theater. It was dark, using it for making sauerkraut. Her mother made sauerkraut in the old theater. The seats were gone by then, but she still remembers the booth at the entrance and the screen in the back and playing with her siblings in the dark. And as it turns out, girl number 1 and girl number 2 are here tonight, and I would like to ask them to stand. Girl number 1 is Evelyn Pogue, sitting right there. Would you please stand, Evelyn? And Olga Ingram is girl number 2. She's not going to stand. Is she going to stand? Oh, come on. Thank you very much. That is one of the very few ways you will ever get Evelyn Pogue to stand up in this church. All right. Let's take you back to old Uxbridge now, having had the story with a song that would have been heard in Uxbridge around 1900 or even the late 1800s.
Floats and falls from off the twisted bough to lie and faint within your silken bosom, within your silken bosom, as that does now. Or would I were a little burnished apple for you to pluck me gliding by so cold, while sonnets shade your robe of long-root apple, your robe of lawn and your hair's spun gold.
So John has asked me to come here tonight to talk a little bit about the history of Uxbridge around this time period. So in 1890, we had actually come a long way from 1803 when the first Europeans set foot in the Uxbridge Valley. But in all honesty, our progress was pretty slow. And one of the problems was that we were not one community, but two. We were two. On the east side of Uxbridge Brook, we had the subdivision laid out by John Plank, and Main Street was at its core. On the west side of Uxbridge Brook, we had the subdivision laid out by Joseph Gould, and that would have been Toronto Street and Gouldville, which it was present-day Water Street and Joseph Street. And when they dammed the brook for the mills, all of a sudden that gap became huge because we then had two very large ponds in between both settlements. We all know Elgin Pond. Some people, though, don't realize that there was a second pond, a much bigger pond, that was called Wheeler's Pond. And it went all the way from Mill Street, all the way up to where the Tin Mill, Boyd Sports, Sacred Heart is today. Well, the town fathers realized in the 1850s that this was not going to work. There was only one connection, and that was a very narrow laneway, which we now call Mill Street. So they built a bridge at the northern end of Wheeler's Pond, and that became Brock Street. And it worked. In the 1860s, the whole commercial part of Main Street had switched from north-south and had gone on to Brock Street. There started to be buildings being built. And then when the railway came in 1871, the town boomed. All of a sudden, the bridge basically disappeared, and buildings on both the north and the south filled Brock Street. There was a problem, though. They were all made of wood. And zoning was not that big a deal back in at this point it would be the 1880s. And I'll let you guess what happened. Because in 1883, when you have a hotel, stable, and blacksmith shop all side by side, the whole north side of Brock Street burned down from Toronto to Maine. Now, the business people were very quick to rebuild the buildings. And this time they used stone, they used brick, and humble people, they named all the buildings after themselves. So you had the Crosby block, the Anderson block. Hopefully you see I think we're one ahead. Yeah, you see the Henry block there. And for the really important purpose of tonight is the Hardy block. Now the next slide will show you 1890. And this gives you a really good picture of what the town was like. First of all, you'll notice there's no pavement. The roads were not paved because there were no cars in Uxbridge in 1890. This was definitely still the era of the horse. There were, in fact, cars starting to appear in some of the southern districts, Markham, Pickering. And you could tell the people in Uxbridge really were very suspicious of this new invention, of this automobile, because whenever there was an accident between an automobile and a horse and buggy or a pedestrian, it was front page news in Uxbridge. It was like, beware of this invention. You'll notice in the picture that there were wooden sidewalks. There's actually electrical lines. Electricity had just started coming into town. They constructed the electrical pond off Toronto Street in the mid-1880s, but it really was just to support the mills and downtown. There were street lights, but they turned them off right after supper, so I don't know how effective those really were. There was no refrigeration, obviously, so a very common sight that you would have seen in the winter was men, teams of horses out on Elgin Pond and Wheeler Pond, sawing away, creating blocks for, of course, the ice boxes in the summer. You'll also notice that there are telephone lines. It had just started in 1890. There were 3 fledgling telephone companies, each trying to get people hooked up to their system. When they got 5 or 6 people, once again, it was front page news. So by the time we get really to 1890, the picture of Uxbridge is one of starting to be sort of comfortable. Some of the really nice homes started to be built on 1st, 2nd, 3rd Avenue down Main Street, but the town was pretty gritty. But it was prosperous because of the mills, because of the agricultural industry. We had factories. The gold medal factory was originally a furniture factory. It was out by where the railway station is. It was very prosperous. So people had money in their pockets, and they were really looking forward to a new type of entertainment.
Thank you, Dave. That sets us up nicely for the whole remainder of the time. This was a time from the very late 1800s when the movies first came, not to Uxbridge, unfortunately. They didn't first come to Uxbridge, they came to Zephyr. But anyways, a few years later, they would come to Uxbridge. It was a time of great turbulence and change. If you'd been living at this time, especially if you were a middle-aged person, the changes you were seeing were traumatic, and this we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along. So this is a roadmap for where we're going today. We're going to cover 30 years of film. This is the earliest phase of the film industry. We're going to cover each decade. And the scenario in Uxbridge is basically the same worldwide, or certainly in first world countries like Canada and in the United States. So in the first decade of the 20th century, the movies, and by the way, all of the movies that we're going to talk about are silent, quote unquote. In other words, there's no soundtrack that's attached to the film. That would come at the very end of the period that we're going to think about. These are movies for which any kind of sound accompaniment had to be supplied by the venue, by the exhibitor. So it changed from venue to venue. First decade of the 20th century, it's mostly traveling exhibitors, people who are coming around from town to town. It could be small towns, it can be big cities, and have the films with them and the projector. They show the films, but they usually also have a variety of other entertainments because these films are typically short. They're about, as you'll see in a moment, a minute or a few minutes long at the most. They're single reel films. And then they have to be rewound, and so there's other types of entertainment as well. In the second phase, Uxbridge gets its first storefront theaters, as I'm calling them. They're better known as Nickelodeons. In Toronto, they were called theatoriums. These are a cheap, kind of low-cost venues, would have just had typically wooden chairs inside, maybe a blanket for a screen or something like that. So very humble venues. And in Uxbridge, we'll discover had a number of these storefront theaters. And finally, the last phase we'll think about is when Uxbridge finally got a permanent theater located in the same place where the storefronts had been on Main Street, the photo we were looking at the very beginning. So the first movies that were shown in Uxbridge after Zephyr got to see their films in 1898 was in 1900, in the fall of 1900 at the Uxbridge Fall Fair. This would have been probably in a tent. And by the way, all of this information I culled thanks to a number of people, but basically looking through the old newspapers for hints as to when and where movies would have been shown. So this showed at the Uxbridge Fall Fair. The paper doesn't tell us what movies exactly were shown, but we know that they were Edison films, and that would not have been unusual. And we do also know from something that the person writing the newspaper article said that possibly one or two films were deemed somewhat controversial or offensive, because the newspaper person says there are a few, quote, that we would eliminate if we were making a selection. This is a 19th century way of saying, not sure we approve of those films. So we don't know what film the writer is referring to, but it could have been probably the most infamous of the Edison corpus of films in the late 1800s, a film called The Kiss. It features, yes, a couple kissing on screen for about 60 seconds. So we're going to watch this clip. This would have been typical in length, typical in content as well of early movies. More than likely, there would not have been musical accompaniment because these films were so short. It's hard to even kind of start a piece when the film is almost ready to end. So watch carefully as this piece goes by. Our pianist tonight has come as a seasoned pianist, silent film pianist, Alexandra Weiss. She'll take a bow later on, but she's going to play her first number for us. So here's the Edison picture, The Kiss.
You can see that music was very important to these films. And Uxbridge was a very musical community. In 1913, there was a British cathedral organist who made a cross-country tour playing in all the big cities of Canada. With one exception, he came to Uxbridge because according to his agent, Uxbridge had the reputation of being the finest musical town north of Toronto. I think in large part this was probably due to the churches. We had, in 1880, we had 9 churches. And I think you can see some of the early versions of each of them. So we had the Anglican Church, St. Paul's, which was wooden at that time. The Baptist Church, that's actually their second church. It's the back of a business on Brock Street now. We had 2 Presbyterian churches. We had Chalmers across the road, and then St. Andrew's was up on Quaker Hill. Sacred Heart, the original Catholic Church. Salvation Army had a church. It's now Gangstas, Mad Millie's. If you ever went into Mad Millie's, you would actually sit in the pews. And then there were 3 Methodist denominations in town. There were actually 5 province-wide, but there were 3 here. You had the Wesleyan Methodists, who were the biggest. You had the Bible Christians, who had a church on Main Street North. And then you might recognize the building that was the building for the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is now an apartment building. The 4 big churches had huge Sunday schools. I should mention that those Methodist denominations eventually merged, and that allowed for the building of course, the biggest church in town, which was Trinity Methodist, Trinity United. They had huge Sunday schools. Trinity would get 200 children a Sunday in their Sunday school. Their youth groups were big. Music was essential to all of them. They took turns putting on concerts for the town. Vocal soloists, instrumental soloists. Not to be outdone, the adult groups in the church. Of course, there were women's groups in the various churches. Their meetings consisted of a lot of hymns. They always had a pianist and an assistant pianist. The men, Trinity had a group called the Men's Bible Club. It had an orchestra. It wasn't the first orchestra in Uxbridge, but it was the largest, and it lasted for over 30 years. The organists themselves seemed to be really talented. Ruby Nichols started playing at churches in town when she was a teenager. She ended up going to the Royal Conservatory of Music, wrote an opera, which was performed in Uxbridge. She became a professor at the Conservatory of Music, and she and a number of organists in town were lured away. Toronto, New York, one as far away as Seattle, Washington. So there was something in the water. They were really, really good. Now, there was also music, of course, outside of the churches. There was a concert band, a community band that played in the summer. They went in parades, and they performed concerts each weekend in town. And in this time period, there were really 2 places where they played, but I like this picture. A very common place for them to perform was in front of the library. But if you look really quickly, you can see Wheeler's Pond in the background. It's kind of a unique shot. Finally, in December 1901, the music hall was built. There was a hall there before called Ontario Hall, but it was a lot smaller, and it was wooden, and it burned down. So the music hall, the first attested indoor exhibition in the music hall was in April 1902 by the London Imperial Moving Picture Company. There was no mention of music, but it may have been supplemented by illustrated songs, a common practice. A popular song in Uxbridge from around this time was Silver Threads Among the Gold.
Twilight time is stealing, years go swiftly by, silver hair revealing, and the light
So Dave has set us up for the first period of traveling exhibitors, and we're going to look at two films that showed in Uxbridge, one in the music hall that Dave just mentioned, and the other one in a church. We're going to start with the church. The person you see on the screen is a traveling exhibitor, a real guy who existed, named James Stubbs. This was a Peterborough man, local person, and many traveling exhibitors were local people. The movie industry, when it got started in the early 1900s, meant that a lot of people shifted employment. Actually, the person who was the traveling exhibitor for Zephyr, I shouldn't mention Zephyr, competing town, but was a person, I think George Fenton was his name, who had temporarily gone into, exhibiting films. He was a railway worker, but decided to go opt for the movies. So the movies employed a number of people, both in terms of musical accompaniment, but also in terms of exhibiting stuff. So James Stubbs was one such a person. And typical of the show that he would put on of an evening would be short films, like the films we just saw, but also a variety of other entertainments, which he had to supply mainly himself. Possibly another person was involved, we're not sure. There would have been songs, possibly illustrated songs with a little image in the background, but there also would have been a gramophone, and in this case it's referred to as a gramophone concert. So the paper reports on this, and again, the only reason we know that this happened is because thankfully the Uxbridge paper decided to write this up. So he was performing in the Methodist church. I'm not sure exactly which one, actually, possibly the larger one, but here's what the paper says. Mr. Stubbs is able to give as good a gramophone concert as one is likely to hear. It goes on to refer to the fact that he had moving pictures as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known that movies were part of his show. So, gramophone concert. We wanted to illustrate this for you because it's an interesting phenomenon. In the very early 1900s, gramophones were still fairly rare. It was still a big deal to hear a gramophone being played. And as it turns out, Dave Rehill has in his own home, in his private collection, a gramophone, and he's going to play it for us, maybe tell us a little bit about it.
I'm not sure how the next 3 minutes is going to go, because it's Murphy's Law. When we did this before, I knew he was talking about gramophones, so I brought it in as a prop. This time around, John said, well, play it. I said, okay. I haven't played it in a long time. So I went to play it for some people here before this started, and of course the spring kind of went wonky. So I'm not sure what the sound's going to be like. Some people here may have heard gramophones before, but last year there were people who'd never actually seen them play, so we thought we'd show it. This was my great-grandfather's gramophone. That's my great-grandmother over there sitting beside it with my grandfather. The picture was about 1908, so let's cross fingers that this actually works. Winding is very important. Hand crank. And what's on it is a wax cylinder. I'm sorry.
That's all right. It held us all in suspense. I should say, as Dave was showing us the roll, I realized this is a phonograph player, not a gramophone. The gramophone player would have had a disc like the one that you see here. So this is an earlier type of media technology. For those of you who have no idea what we're talking about, the phonograph preceded the gramophone. Okay, so you can imagine the gramophone concert having happened in 1903. Next slide, please. So the next event we want to talk about is something that happened at the music hall, shown in the background. Music hall was newly built. This would have been a logical venue, town hall, music hall, music opera hall, sometimes as these things were called, for movies to be shown. The film that we're going to watch was we're going to watch just a clip of it. And by the way, I've spared you tonight to watch an entire film, as was the custom. You would have sat and watched an entire feature film lasting, 2 hours with Alexandra accompanying. So we're not going to do that tonight. But this particular film is this is an excerpt from a film by one of the leading global suppliers of films at the time. So in the early 1900s, the Americans are still kind of neck to neck with European companies, and notably two French companies, Pathé and Gaumont. Pathé and Gaumont actually had an advance, had a lead in terms of the global market in the early 1900s. This would change in the 1910s, as we'll see. The film we're going to see is a Pathé product. It's Cinderella. Yes, there was a Cinderella. In fact, there were multiple Cinderellas before Disney's famous 1950-some film. And the clip we're going to see uses what would have been considered trick photography, sort of new techniques that have been recently introduced. So see if you can spot those. So this will give Alexandra the opportunity to play in a way that's more typical of this time period. One important thing for pianists and for film accompanists to keep in mind was that their music be appropriate to the scene. And one of the ways in which they did that, because they had to play continuous music for hours and hours, was to use borrowed pieces, and preferably pieces that the public knew and recognized. These would have been kind of light classical, popular classical pieces. So Alexandra has chosen for us an appropriate piece or two for this particular scene. Let's see if you can guess what pieces these are.
In December 1909, Uxbridge got its first storefront theater. From then until the early 1940s, the movie picture shows would remain in the same location on Main Street. No photographs survive except this one from around 1910, and we'd like to thank Alan McGilvery for sending us this one. All of these storefronts were in the same location on Main Street in the old Hardy block. And this slide just sort of shows you then and now. So you see the Dominion Bank is now Muko Sushi. And then you have the Hardy block, and Favor Flight is located there now.
So just to repeat, that's the location where all the movies we're going to talk about were taking place right up until the late 1940s. That's a long chunk of time. Here's a list on the screen of all of the names that I could find in the newspaper of the different storefront theaters that were in Uxbridge. Now, as was typical of this time, these storefronts didn't last very long. They were run, somebody would decide, okay, we're going to rent some movies, and did that for less than a year. None of these lasted longer than a year. And they were always in the same place, basically put on a new coat of paint, a new owner, and you start all over again. The names, though, are quite evocative of the larger, more luxurious movie palaces of the day. Some of them are quite odd, but Classic Theater is a standard name that you would find in other towns. But generally speaking, Uxbridgeites, as they were called at the time, not Uxbridgians, were quite fond of the movies. And when in the in-between periods when there weren't theaters, people complained that we needed another movie theater. So when the Classic opened, this was in December 1909, so basically we're really talking about 1910, the Uxbridge Journal raved that the moving pictures, that's the term used most often, are real good and are drawing large audiences.
By the 1910s, it was common for storefronts to have a pianist, especially in Uxbridge, where pianos were made. The gold medal factory was originally furniture, but then actually started building both pianos and organs. Now, most of the pianists were teenagers, and rarely were they ever mentioned. We have two examples from the journal of these teenage pianists. In 1917, 17-year-old Violet Lamb was the pianist, and with her 22-year-old sister Olive Lamb, they both sang songs during the reels. Both were mentioned in connection with the opening of the All-Star Theater in December 1917. The Lamb sisters were born just outside of Port Perry, and they turned to entertainment actually when their farm burned down. The only other specific mention, and this is quite interesting, is of a young man named Stanley St. John. I think we probably recognize the St. John name. He disappears for a while, and then he reappears. And if you go to the Canadian Encyclopedia and look up early dance bands and orchestras in Canada, there's a section that lists all the main hotels in Toronto and the resident orchestras that were there. And of the 9 orchestras that were connected with the Royal York, 2 of them were Uxbridgeites. One was Horace Lapp and his orchestra. Lapp, you may recognize, was a mayor in Uxbridge, probably a cousin, and Stanley St. John. Okay, there was a picture of his, a stub from the Royal York that showed his orchestra. And every once in a while in the 1930s, he would bring his orchestra up to Uxbridge. But they are the only 2 that were ever mentioned.
So this is a real problem for just kind of finding out what was happening on the ground. Is if we only know the names of 2 people who were performing music for the movies. I mean, there were many people who were playing music for the movies. So it's a bit difficult to find these things out. So next slide, please. The 1910s obviously are an important time. Turbulence worldwide. The First World War marks the end of European companies, film companies like Pathé and Gaumont dominating global markets. The 1910s are the time when the United States begins its ascent as the global leader of supplying films. And this will change the way people watch movies and what kinds of movies people watch worldwide. Just for a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the film The Birth of a Nation? If you'd raise your hand. Okay, so some people have. This is a controversial film. It was released in 1915, and it's a highly racist film from our point of view today. It's essentially a film that glorifies the Ku Klux Klan. They come to the rescue of the poor whites, quote unquote. You'll see this in the title cards, who are imprisoned by the freed blacks, quote unquote. And there's blackface, acting, and so on. So for us, this is quite repulsive. And there were protests at the time when this film was released. Nevertheless, The Birth of a Nation has no equivalent commercially. Think of any big film in your lifetime, whether it's Gone with the Wind, one of the most successful American films of the 20th century, Jaws, Titanic in the 1990s. The Birth of a Nation broke all of these records. This film had a run, not just of a few years, but over a decade. It was still showing, around the world. This was the film that made the American industry what it was, and part of its success had to do with the score, the special music that was associated with it. Of course, this is not a fixed score. It's not a soundtrack score. You would have had to rent part of the score as maybe a piano score to be able to accompany it or whatnot. But it had special music that came attached to it. This was a huge budget. It outdid any American film prior to this time. So the first time we hear about this film in Uxbridge, and I wasn't expecting this. In fact, I expected that Canada in general would shun this horribly racist American film, but no, it was a success here as it was everywhere. First time we hear about this film is the year after it was released. In 1916, evidently the smaller theaters here did not have enough money to rent this film because it would have been very expensive, but it was showing in Oshawa. So in 1916, the paper reports that a motorload of young people head off to Oshawa. That's not them, but it's a picture that's contemporary. They go to Oshawa to see the film, but they can't get in because the place is full. That's how huge this film was. 4 years later, and The Birth of a Nation is still on its decade-long run. It is exhibited in Sunderland. So the ad you see on the left is the advertisement for the 1920 Sunderland screening of this film. Big deal, right? And I've circled at the bottom, you can't see it, but it says in the ad, this picture will be shown with the original musical, what does it say? The original musical score. Exactly what this would have meant is hard to say, but quite possibly it would have been maybe a pianist and maybe a few other instruments who would have been reproducing as best they could the original music. All right, so all of that to prepare you for this film, but as it's hard to get around The Birth of a Nation was such a huge phenomenon and was also present here in Uxbridge. The scene we're going to watch and hear is mercifully short, but it'll give you a sense of the movie. It's near the end of the film when the Ku Klux Klan comes to the rescue. And the music that was used for the special score was partly borrowed classical pieces. This most famous of moments in this film uses what is probably the most famous classical piece used in the movies, and that is Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. We'll hear that in this scene.
Wow. Racism, political extremism. It's too bad they didn't have a Canadian influence in Hollywood during the silent period, showing maybe kinder and more comedic type movies. But wait, they did. You've just seen The Kiss a few minutes ago. The woman in The Kiss, her name was Mary Irwin, and she was from Whitby, Ontario. I assume almost everyone here has seen some clip of the Keystone Cops. Yeah, it came from the Keystone Studios, which was known as the Fun Factory. And of course, its founder and director was Max Sennett, who was from Montreal. And the one woman that I wish more of us knew about is the woman on the far right there. Her name was Marie Dressler. And she was a favorite of Charlie Chaplin's. She appeared in a number of his films. But she successfully and very uniquely managed to make the transition into talkies, and it had quite a long career in Hollywood. Her home in Cobourg, Ontario, is now a museum for women in film. But of course, the most famous Canadian would have been Mary Pickford, known as America's sweetheart. Now, she had a terrible personal life. She was born in Cabbagetown in Toronto. Her father died an alcoholic. Her brother and sister were actors, died alcoholics. She had a number of husbands, but her persona on screen was one of optimism, bubbly. You see the ad up there, it says, Pickford, her gladness is contagious. She was one of the one of the leading stars of the emerging Hollywood star system. We're now going to see a Pickford film for a few years earlier. Poor Little Rich Girl. This was from 1917. In this scene, Pickford shows versatility, comic, tragic, male and female. For this film, the film pianist needed to follow an action of the players, which was a manual which the pianist had to follow. The technique that Alexander will use is a mimicking scene action, which was also known as Mickey Mousing.
So that was a Mary Pickford film that showed in Sunderland. So this is the same evening, that same evening in Sunderland. So just so you're not confused, I was unable to find a clip from Pollyanna, which was a film that was shown. So we saw one that was slightly earlier, but it's Mary Pickford. But the other film that was shown that same evening in Sunderland, they clearly spent quite a bit of money, was probably Hollywood's leading star in the emerging star system, and that is Charlie Chaplin, another foreigner, a person who was from England and not from the United States. Chaplin was internationally renowned because in part his acting was so physical, so vaudevillian in a way that recalled the early vaudeville entertainment. So the film we're going to see is The Kid. This is a very famous Charlie Chaplin film and features some of his his slapstick comedy. And again, we'll see how Mickey Mousing, the technique that we just saw, or heard rather, is really important in the piano accompaniment for a film. So this showed, as I said, in Sunderland that same evening. Here we go. So these films mark an interesting turning point. I mean, Chaplin's own career is sort of symptomatic of what was happening in the movies at the time. He began by mass producing, as people did, very short movies in which he starred. But by the time we get to about 1920, 1921, he's focusing just on feature films, and he's doing just maybe one very big film every few years. And every Chaplin film that comes out, like The Kid or like The Gold Rush that we will see later on, is a major event. This is a very carefully crafted thing. That's kind of the trend where things are going at this time, by the time we get to the early 1920s. So finally, in October 1921, it's the end of the storefront theaters in Uxbridge. In that same location, so again where that red rectangle is, a permanent movie theater is installed. So you might have gotten the sense in October 1921, oh, well, this is just going to be yet another one of these storefront theaters. But the manager, whose name we know, and again, thanks to Alan McGilvray for providing this information, was a Russian immigrant who'd worked in Toronto as a storekeeper for a little while and then came up to Uxbridge to start his own movie business. And Harris Schulman was his name, or Harry Schulman, was a very enterprising person and a very good businessman. And he made the Strand, which was what he called his theater, last for over 2 decades. So this was the longest running theater in Uxbridge before the Roxy, really. But part of what he had to do was to be sure that everything was running correctly. Most likely he had a pianist. He would have hired a pianist right away. That was kind of something that you had to have. And he had to also be working with Hollywood companies to get regular films, supply of films, standard showing evening of an evening in the Strand. And the Strand showed films every night of the week except for God forbid, right? Sunday. We'll talk about church attendance and Sunday in a bit. And you had usually one feature film, like some of the films we just watched, which lasted about an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. Again, these are films that are all hand cranked, like the phonograph player. There's no electricity is coming around the corner. These are all hand cranked. So it would have depended on the speed of the person cranking the film, but more or less that feature film would have lasted an hour and a half, 2 hours, but there would have been usually 1 or 2 short films before the feature film. So all in all, at least 2 hours worth of entertainment, all of which had to have music that was supplied. We're going to show you another clip from another major feature film. This was one of these Hollywood products. So Hollywood at this time, in order to remain the global leader of supplier of films, is ensuring that it has kind of big budget films that theaters have to rent, and then kind of cheaper films that go along with that. And one of these big budget films that was shown here at the Strand in February 1922 is this following film called The Virgin of Stamboul. The Virgin of Stamboul is a fairly typical Hollywood product at this time, kind of a fantasy. It takes place, well, presumably in Turkey, although it's got sort of somewhere in the East would be kind of the general mood of the thing. And the technique that Alexandra is going to demonstrate for you as we watch this film is something called Orientalism. This is a technique that would have been used in orchestral repertoires of the 19th century, where you're evoking some kind of vague Eastern, quote, Oriental setting, whether it be in China or India or what have you, doesn't matter. The music is essentially the same. It's stereotypical, but that's the sound we're going to hear. Alexandra, in doing the research that she did for the music for this evening, used what would have been called fake books, I guess, at the time. These are books that had stock music for scenes. So if you were a pianist improvising, and at some point a love scene comes up on the screen, you don't know what's going to happen, right? If you haven't seen the film before, you have this anthology in which different moods or different scene types are alphabetized. You go to L for love scene, flip to that page, and sight read the piece that's in that section for love scene. So there would have actually been a section in the book that Alexandra consulted called Oriental. I know it sounds, again, like Birth of the Nation racist, but this would have been a standard thing, and you would have played that pieces like that for a film like The Virgin of Stamboul. The other thing I'll say about this film, because it taps into other stuff we're going to think about, is the changing role of women in the movies. Mary Pickford's own career illustrates this very well. She was known as America's sweetheart, so a demure girl with curls and whatnot. But that was rapidly changing in the 1920s with flapper culture, and we were actually going to see, illicit love affair in this clip. We're going to see a woman smoking too. That would have been, oh my God, terrible thing. So here we go.
The Virgin of Stamboul. We're getting pretty racy here, St. Paul's on a Saturday night. And actually, that was a problem because in the 1920s, church attendance started to really decline in town. Now, historians would tell you that after the First World War, the death, the carnage, faith in our institutions was severely shaken. But in Uxbridge, they were beginning to wonder if maybe movies had something to do with it. And this leads us to the second legacy of our churches, and that's sort of social conservatism in town. We were a very godly and pious people, probably even more than Port Perry, Don. Now, it's no surprise because for over 30 years, page 3 in the journal, 1/3 to 1/2 of it was dedicated to Sunday school lessons and religious news. When funerals were talked about, were reported, the reporters actually summarized the minister's sermons and would give a critique. In 1923, in advance of Easter, the journal put in a big notice saying, "Keep Sunday, March 25th, holy." This conservatism was especially clear when you looked at prohibition and temperance, alcohol. For over 50 years, Uxbridge was a dry community. You couldn't buy or sell alcohol. That started in 1916, and that was due to 2 major temperance movements in town. I mean, it was reflective of the whole province, but there was an Uxbridge Temperance Society and also the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was very, very strong. But Uxbridge was so conservative that in most towns, probably in Port Perry, the leadership and the people that made it up were basically from 3 denominations, the teetotaling denominations. And that would have been the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists. But in Uxbridge, even the wine-guzzling Anglicans had representation in these 2 societies. And unfortunately, it's late at night, so you won't be able to see it. But if you leave by the bell tower, there's 2 stained glass windows. And one, it's partially hidden by the staircase, but there's 4 initials in it, CETS. And it stands for the Church of England Temperance Society. So Mr. Schulman knew he had a problem. And so he adapted. He started to run weekly notices of his good, clean comedy at the Strand. More Christian films, like From the Manger to the Cross, were shown in 1923. The journal called From the Manger to the Cross one of the best shows that has ever been the privilege of the townspeople to view for some time, adding that the Strand should show more of these high-class pictures from time to time. You're about to see a scene of Christ standing before Pilate. By 1923, this film, which was actually produced in 1912, was already old-fashioned. Tastes were beginning to change. Representatives of the newly emerging biblical epic is Cecil B. DeMille's King of Kings, a 1927 film shown at the Strand in 1929. It opened with a Roman orgy featuring scantily clad Jacqueline Logan as courtesan Mary Magdalene. The Strand needed good publicity because this was, again, a little racy, and went as far as featuring recommendations from local ministers. "My message is go and see it," stated Reverend J.C. Robinson of Chalmers Presbyterian Church. The Reverend P.G. Powell of St. Paul's agreed. "This film was bound to come sooner or later, and I approve of it."
So you can see that Harry Schulman, in managing the Strand, had a delicate balance, but he evidently did very well. He managed to get to not only keep the Strand afloat, but to get people to come in, so much so that in the mid-1920s, the theater underwent a major upgrade. New seating, opera-style chairs were installed, so the description says. Again, we have no photographs of the interiors, or at least that I could find. And I would, by the way, urge any of you to go back to your attics if you have boxes of old photos and see if there is a photograph, but we haven't found one yet. One of the things that Schulman did after the renovation, so now the theater was quite large, could seat about 200 people, was to introduce on Thursday nights a sing-along, a community sing-along, where people would actually come into the theater and sing old songs. By old songs, meaning songs from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And some of the songs are listed, in fact, in the newspaper, and one of the songs that I found is a number that hopefully one or two of you know. So in the advertisement for these this sing-along, Thursday night sing-along, which Schulman called the Sing Them Again series. It's an interesting title which suggests that these were old songs that people wanted to hear. They wanted comfort with these old songs. At the end of the advertisement, it says, "Everybody join in the singing." So we're going to ask you, since we've provided the lyrics for the chorus or the refrain for this particular song, when we get to the chorus, if you would also, everyone would also join in the singing. This is Daisy Bell.
Daisy Bell, Daisy Bell, my heart is yearning for you. There is a flower within my heart, Daisy, Daisy, planted one day by a glancing dart, planted by Daisy Bell. Whether she loves me or loves me not, sometimes it's hard to tell. Yet I am longing to share the lot of beautiful Daisy Bell. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer due. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be a stylish marriage, I can't afford a carriage, but you'll look sweet on the seat of a bicycle built for two. We will go tandem as man and wife, Daisy, Daisy, pedaling away down the road of life. I and my Daisy Bell. When the road's dark, we can both despise dress you look sweet. There on the seat of a bicycle built for two.
The term Strand is actually a very common movie theater name, and it most likely originates from the Strand Theatre District in London, England. There were a number of strands in Ontario, including Toronto, you can see that on the right, 2 strands in New York City, the Strand and Brooklyn's Mark Strand. Movie palaces like these could afford an orchestra that played an elaborate prologue, which you can see circled in red, before films. The one on this poster is Chaplin's 1925 Gold Rush, the 5th highest grossing film of the silent period. The Strand also showed Gold Rush in December 1925, likely with just a pianist. It advertised Chaplin of the Big Shoes, Trick Derby, Little Cane, the baggy trousers, and funny shuffling walk. Here is the film's most memorable scene, the potato dance. It illustrates what the Uxbridge Journal referred to as the Chaplin genius.
you can hear that this it's a very tricky thing, very difficult thing, really, in a way. I mean, Alexander makes it sounds very easy to match your music to what's happening on screen. But this would have been the normal experience of the movies for decades before the talkies came along, and that's where we're headed right now, to the talkies. We're going to show you two last clips tonight, again, all silent films. And both of these clips are meant to illustrate major changes that were happening in the mid to late 1920s that would eventually lead to the talkies. If change had been happening at a rapid pace before, say, 1920, it was happening even faster for the remainder of that decade. So the first trend is just the general speeding up of modern life, with cars, all kinds of other transportation. Things are just generally speeding up. People are more and more aware of time passing by, the clock, as illustrated in this particular shot from this film. So whereas the earliest film stars of the Hollywood stars of the 1920s were sometimes people who were not from the United States, by the late 1920s, it was starting to become standard to have Hollywood stars that were born and bred in the USA, like Harold Lloyd. Harold Lloyd is now probably not a name that most of us recognize, but was a major Hollywood star of the late 1920s, a comic star, much like Chaplin, born and raised in Nebraska. And the film for which he's most famous is the shot that you have there is from the film Safety Last from 1923. The clip we're going to see is from a film called Speedy. It's from 1928. We're going to watch, we've kind of been testing your endurance to watch silent films. So we're going to watch a full 5 minutes, so brace yourselves. This is a wonderful film. We'll watch the opening titles as a way of showing that opening titles and the music that the pianist would choose for the opening titles were crucial to setting up the rest of the movie. So this is the movie Speedy, which showed at the Strand in the late 1920s, 28. Oh, yes, the other thing I'll say about this is that one of the shticks that Schulman used to get people to come into the theater was door lottery prizes from time to time, especially if it was a big film like this one here. So for this particular film, which showed for 3 nights at the Strand, Schulman advertised prizes that would, for a door prize, that would include a pair of shaker blankets and a china tea set.
the era of the silent film was starting to decline. The second big change leading to talkies was home electricity. In the late 1920s, it was now becoming more common with wall plugs in people's homes. This 1927 ad for Rundle's Hardware in Sunderland shows a wall plug. Rundle's was across the street from present-day Pilgrim Hardware store. Another change, thanks to electricity, was more long-distance calls, so more time on the phone. A relevant movie is The Chaser, which was showed at the Strand in the summer of 1930, 8 months before the talkies finally came to Uxbridge. It starred Harry Langdon, a comedian briefly popular in the late 1920s. In true style, the Strand ad called The Chaser the greatest comedy going, telling Uxbridgeites that it will make you a Langdon fan for life, which is sort of ironic because this film marked Langdon's being fired from Warner Studios, and it led to his downfall.
It's a very enjoyable film. I didn't know this film before until I did the research for this. And so there's so many films from the 1920s that have been forgotten. Of course, we know about The Kid and Gold Rush, but a film like this is quite a good one. In March 1931, the Strand announced something you have been waiting for: the talkies. Schulman shut down the theater for a few months because this would require a major renovation. Wiring for sound, that's where we get that expression, was very expensive. Schulman had to purchase an entire new system. There were several systems that were available to him. This was, I believe, a Canadian system, a Northern Electric system. The logo is at the top, which probably cost him at the time in the neighborhood of about $20,000. It was a huge expense. But Schulman was confident that he had a home audience and that people would come for the talkies. On opening night, Schulman showed a feature film called The Squeaker. This was a live action film, preceded by a short film, which was standard. There usually was a short comic film at the beginning. This short film, however, featured a new star in Hollywood, Mickey Mouse, shown at the left. And in fact, Disney and Mickey Mouse was in part responsible for some of the finest early sound films where there's a great attention being paid to, well, Mickey Mousing. At the bottom of the ad for the Strand's first talkies was a notice. It read, "Everybody come and say goodbye to the silent pictures." So we want to say goodbye to you this evening, and thank you for coming. We will say goodbye by singing a song. This is a song that hopefully at least half of you know, and so we will ask you to join us in the chorus at the very end.
Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and days of old lang syne? For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. Join us. For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. Yeah, because really,